So this is the fourth video in our little series on prayer. The first video was about change your life with God through powerful prayer. The second one was don't sink your prayers before you pray. And the third one was determination in prayer for answers. So now we turn to our video today. And this is based on two scriptures. And this is the first time that we're venturing outside of the teachings of Jesus and to the teachings of his apostles. Actually, two of the three of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. James, the actual name is Jacob in Greek. So we're going to refer to James as Jacob because that's what the scriptures refer to him as. It's only the English Bible that calls him James, and we're not going to follow that because it's incorrect. So we're going to refer to them as Peter, Jacob, and John, the three apostles of Jesus who were the inner circle of the 12. Those are the three that he took on field trips quite often and spoke to apart from the other 12. So those three are the most important of the 12. Now, let's go ahead and have a look at the scriptures. The first one is in Jacob chapter 5, verse 16. And many of you are very familiar with this verse, but we're going to be reading the rooted word, Common English translation. So you'll be less familiar with the wording of it, but you're going to hear accurately what God's testimony actually says from the Greek. An equitably just one's begging to bind is having much strength, itself inworking actively. You said that doesn't sound like anything I ever heard from the Bible. That's right, because the English translations that we have today are mistranslations for the most part. This draws out the accurate statement that God made. So let's look at it. An equitably just one's begging to bind. So an equitably just one, we usually read righteous. Okay, a righteous man, they'll say, but it doesn't say man. And so they are interpreting when they say a righteous man's prayers. It's someone who is righteous, but the word doesn't mean righteous like right in God's eyes. It means equitably just. It literally means that. So an equitably just one's begging to bind. It's a special word for prayer. There are different words for prayer that we call prayer in English, but in Greek, they're different words. They're not the same thing. You say, well, the category of those is prayer. Okay, we can say the category of those is prayer, right? But then prayer wouldn't exist in the Bible when one of them actually is prayer, wishfully praying. But this one is not that. This one is begging to bind. So what does that mean? Begging to bind. This is a special kind of prayer. This is where you are willing to bind yourself to this until you get it. That's how much you're begging for it. You are not going to let go until you get it. It is like Jacob in the Old Testament when he wrestled with God or the angel, okay, all night and would not let him go until he blessed him. He was begging to bind himself to the angel of the Lord until he blessed him, until he got what he wanted. That's what this is. So an equitably just one's begging to bind is having much strength, itself inworking actively. Now that's what's interesting. Okay? That's what's so interesting. This add-on on the end. So I'm going to have a look here, and we're going to see what it says in the New King James. It says the effective, that's the word that we're looking at. They put it on the beginning, but it's actually on the end as an add-on, as a participle. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. They turn it into an adjective, but it's not an adjective in the Greek. It's a participle, which is a verb that is describing that noun. It's an action that's describing that noun. The noun is doing. So it's self-inworking actively, and they completely lost the middle voice of the verb, of the participle. So the word itself. It's inworking, it is itself inworking. The begging to bind is itself inworking. Working inside, and in, not really into, but working inside actively. But understand, the person must be equitably just for this to be true. You must be righteous. And remember, how are you righteous? You should be able to tell me by now. 1 John 3:7. My dear children, do not be deceived. He who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. Or New King James, he who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. So are you righteous? Have you stopped sinning? Because in the context of 1 John 3:7, he says that you must stop sinning to be righteous. You cannot be equitably just if you're sinning. It's impossible. The two go together. You cannot do what's right and be righteous, be equitably just if you are sinning. You must stop. We've already gone through that in 1 John 3. We talked about that extensively. Now we're going to look at 1 Peter 3 to see the details behind this, where he directly says that you must stop sinning. Yeah, for this to be true. Peter says it. Jacob said it, right, with the understanding that the listener understood that about being equitably just. But Peter spells it out. If we look at a couple verses before, so we're going to look from 1 Peter 3, 10 through 12. And again, this is the Common English translation of the rooted word. For he who is determining to love life and to stare at good days must stop his tongue from off of worthless evil, and his lips from the worthless evil, not talking to create a decoy. He must slant off from off of worthless evil, and he must do good. He must seek peace, and he must run errands timidly with dread for it. For peace. That the eyes of the Lord are upon equitably just ones, and his ears are upon their begging to bind. But the Lord's visage is upon those doing worthless evil. All right. So you see at the end you've got something like what Jacob said, but even heavier. And preceding that, Peter is giving you instructions about how to. Okay, so let's read that verse 12 again at the end of these three. That the eyes of the Lord are upon equitably just ones, and his ears are upon their begging to bind. again the begging to bind of the equitably just one, that the equitably just one is so serious about this matter that he is willing to bind himself to it while he is begging until he gets it. But the Lord's visage, that implies disapproval and anger. But the Lord's visage is upon those doing worthless evil. He is on them. Like at them. So back up, verse 10. For he who is determining to love life and to stare at good days. You want good days in your life? This is the answer of how. Are you determining to love life and to have good days ahead? Here is the answer of how. He must stop his tongue from off of worthless evil, and his lips from the worthless evil, not talking to create a decoy. No decoys. You cannot say something, even if it's not true, but you know that it's going to mislead someone. That's a decoy. That's what the word means. It's literally a decoy. You must not do that. Stop it. Verse 11. He must slant off of worthless evil, and he must do good. You must get away from worthless evil. Get a distance between you and worthless evil and do good. You must, it says. It's a command. It's not a suggestion, not a recommendation. He must seek peace. You must seek peace. And he goes further. And he must run errands timidly with dread for it. That's right, with dread for it. You must be running around timidly doing errands to get that peace. And then it says in verse 12, that. It's saying that if you don't have those in verse 10 and 11, this next part cannot be true about you. You cannot be equitably just, because it says that the eyes of the Lord are upon equitably just ones. Absolutely not. This is what equitably just means. He is described in 2 verses what equitably just means. What does righteous mean? And if you were doing verse 10 and 11, then when we get to verse 12, and it says that the eyes of the Lord are upon equitably just ones, it means you. And his ears are upon their begging to bind. Not just wishful praying, like shooting up, kind of a Hail Mary, as they say in the Catholic Church. I say it because I spent 7 years in Poland, ministering to the Catholics. So, it's not just shooting up a prayer. I call them arrow prayers. It's not just shooting a prayer up and hoping that God hears it. It's begging yourself to God by binding yourself to that begging until he answers with a blessing and not letting go. But that is not going to work if you're not doing verse 10 and 11. So you must pay attention to this. This is absolutely critical on the most serious matters that you have to pray over, to bind yourself, to beg God for until he gives it to you. You must examine yourself. In verses 10 and 11, I will put it in the description down below. So, this time, I want you to take 30 minutes. I want you to take 30 minutes, and I want you to do two things. I want you to start the 30 minutes with a couple of minutes where you're examining yourself over the past 3 days. Jesus was in the grave 3 days, so let's take 3 days back and examine yourself over those 3 days. We're coming up to Easter next weekend. At least here in Ukraine, we celebrate it next weekend. Look at yourself over the last 3 days and ask, do you match verse 10 and 11? And if you find that you don't, you must ask God for forgiveness. And you must reset yourself and orient yourself to be one who is determining to love life and to stare at good days. And then doing those things which it says that if you are that person who is going to determine to love life and to stare at good days, you must stop your tongue from off of worthless evil and your lips from the worthless evil, not talking to create a decoy. And you must slant off from off of worthless evil, and you must do good, and you must seek peace, and you must run errands timidly with dread for it. All of that. So you must first examine yourself. If you find that you have not done that, you must ask God for forgiveness and then determine to do that over the next few days. And do it. Now, as you are doing it, the next day that you pray. So that's your first 30 minutes. It's not going to take 30 minutes probably. Maybe it will, because asking God for forgiveness. The next day when you pray, you should have been doing verse 10 and 11 that day or the day before. Depends on whether you're praying at the beginning or the end of the day in this case. But you should have 24 hours where you've been doing verses 10 and 11. And this second day is where you start your begging to bind. You bind yourself to that begging of God. And you say back to God, I know that now that I've set my mind off of worthless evil and to do good and do what is equitably just, that your eyes are upon me and your ears are upon my begging to bind. Hear my begging to bind. Don't call it prayer. Call it begging to bind, because that's what it is. This will take you to a whole other level. May the Lord bless you as you seek Him with all your heart.